The year is 1918. A deadly epidemic is about to strike America. Thousands have already died in Europe, not from World War I, but from a deadly flu. News overseas is censored, and the U.S. is unprepared.
The year is 2003. A deadly epidemic is striking China. News out of China is censored, and people only become aware of the disease as it spreads to other countries, infecting thousands worldwide. Disease has plagued civilization for thousands of years. Almost as old as disease is mankind's quest to find cures. Medical exploration has led to discoveries that have lessened the spread of disease and have, in some cases, completely eradicated it. The free exchange of information is key to the prevention of massive outbreaks. However, not every government is open to the idea of sharing. Without this exchange of information, diseases can spread quickly around the world without warning. Before the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, international communication between doctors was almost non-existent. The only real international medical organization was the Red Cross, which dealt primarily with wars and natural disasters. No one was ready for the disaster that came in 1918.
The first sign of influenza appeared in March 1918 when mess cook Private Albert Mitchell reported sick at Camp Funston, Kansas, complaining of a sore throat and aches. He was one of 60,000 soldiers based at the training camp awaiting deployment to Europe to fight in the World War. A week later, there were 522 cases. This was the first wave of flu in America, and it was just the tip of the iceberg. The theory is that the American soldiers carried the virus with them to Europe, where it altered, making it even more lethal. When they returned in the fall, they brought with them one of the deadliest diseases the world has ever encountered, the Spanish influenza. Thousands in Europe had already died from the disease, but news censorship caused by the war left most of the world unaware of its deadly toll. Boston was the point of re-entry for both the soldiers and the flu. Around August 27th, sailors stationed at Commonwealth Pier in Boston began reporting to sickbay with flu symptoms. Within 2 weeks, 2,000 men of the 1st Naval District were sick. With sailors and soldiers as carriers, the disease moved rapidly across America, eerily following the rail lines that carried them home. The medical community was unprepared for the onslaught.
They were totally overloaded and totally unprepared for an epidemic of this magnitude. They did the best they could, but with the attack rates, the death rates, the enormity of it all was something that was very difficult to prepare for. Even though the masks really weren't very effective in preventing transmission and infection of a viral agent. But there was an edict in San Francisco that everyone had to wear a mask.
Go in the park or something, play football, we played something, you'd take them off.
By the time the pandemic ran its course, 20 to 100 million people had perished. In America alone, the death toll was over 600,000.
In the years before the 1918 influenza pandemic, there was little or no international cooperation in tracking and reporting epidemics. The exchange of medical information was slow and there was no coordinated database. In 1948, the founders of the United Nations recognized the need for an international health authority and founded the World Health Organization. Its far-reaching impact would become evident with the eradication of smallpox, a disease that has ravaged civilization for thousands of years. Smallpox is a virus that has plagued mankind for thousands of years and has killed more people than any other infectious disease. It knows no socioeconomic boundaries. The mummy of Pharaoh Ramses V, who died in 1157 BC, is covered with smallpox blisters. In the 18th century, the disease killed 5 ruling European monarchs. At least 300 million people in the 20th century fell victim to smallpox. In 1967, the World Health Organization launched a campaign to eradicate smallpox. It set an arbitrary 10-year timeline to coincide with President Kennedy's 10-year plan to send a man to the moon. The WHO provided the means for a coordinated and worldwide exchange of information, for ideas, and for vaccine. It created a team, the Smallpox Eradication Unit, led by Dr. D.A. Henderson, with the goal to vaccinate 80% of the population of smallpox-infected countries. International teams explored remote portions of third world nations, such as India, Bangladesh, Ghana, and Nigeria, where they encountered pockets of the disease. It soon became evident that the initial goal of mass vaccination was insufficient to control the disease. Rather than vaccinate everyone, the team educated people to recognize smallpox and inform them of infected areas. The medical workers then vaccinated everyone within a 1-mile radius of the infected household, and in this way created a protective ring around the site, thus preventing the spread of smallpox. The exchange of information, the subsequent modification of methods to include detection and containment, eventually eliminated smallpox. In 1977, the last case of smallpox was reported in Somalia. Since then, the WHO has coordinated a global alert system against infectious diseases with specific programs aimed at mitigating the effects of the yearly flu epidemic. It gathers data on influenza activities and collects influenza viruses in order to determine the appropriate vaccination for the next flu season. Health officials often explore and investigate remote portions of Asia, the traditional breeding ground for flu viruses that go on to circle the globe. The WHO's findings go immediately to the international vaccine manufacturers who produce the vaccine. In today's world of modern travel, an infected person can travel thousands of miles in a time much shorter than the incubation period of most viruses. People encountered on the way can become infected and can transmit the diseases to a different hemisphere.
Could the 1918 influenza epidemic happen again?
The possibility of a huge outbreak of influenza is still with us, and the consequences of such an outbreak today might be even more devastating than the horrible epidemic of 1918-1919, which is arguably the worst human epidemic of all time. That's not to say that we haven't made any advances since that time. The things that have advanced since that time include better communication between local areas. I think that the biggest obstacle in terms of exchange of information between governments is that governments, like people, often have self-interests, and so sometimes governments feel that it's in their own self-interest to keep things to themselves. In terms of infectious disease, however, it's often in everybody's best interest to share information and to try to prevent diseases from spreading, because microorganisms don't really know anything about borders, and they don't know anything about countries and governments, and so by working together we can actually prevent the spread of disease.
The recent outbreak of severe acute respiratory syndrome is an excellent example of how an exceedingly unlikely scenario can lead to a global health crisis. Someone eats a civet cat in China, and people die in Toronto. This illustrates clearly that the traditional safety of time and distance no longer applies, and that the risks of infectious disease have become globalized. Newly emerging diseases, like SARS, have exposed how vulnerable we still are to infectious disease. Now, more than ever, it's imperative that international organizations and countries explore new ways to foster the effective exchange of information.